Hello, I'm Daniel Goldmark, Professor of Music and Associate Director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities. Thank you for joining us for the Joseph and Violet Magyar Lecture in Hungarian Studies, which is being presented as part of the 2021 Cleveland Humanities Festival, which is themed Identity. There's a wonderful range of online activities going on throughout this month and into May, including our next talk, which will be with Kevin Young, Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and Poetry Editor of The New Yorker, who will be in conversation on April 7, that's just 2 days from now, with CWRU's Provost and Executive Vice President, Ben Vinson. For information on all of our upcoming events, please visit our website at bakernord.case.edu. The Joseph and Violet Magyar Lecture in Hungarian Studies was established in 2015 through a generous donation from Violet Magyar, who was a triple alumna of Case Western Reserve University. She earned her BA in Biology from Flora Stone Mather College in 1950, her MS from the School of Library Science in 1972, and her PhD from the Graduate School of Information Science in 1980. In 1994, she retired as Manager of Technical Information Services at the Glidden Company. The Magyar Lecture Fund that she established supports lectures and other scholarly events, bringing together faculty, students, and members of the community on a wide range of issues related to the culture of Hungary and Eastern Europe, including literature, music, history, art, media, and politics. There are few more appropriate places in the country than Cleveland to cultivate the study of Hungarian and Eastern European culture. Cleveland once had the second largest Hungarian population in the world. The area of Cleveland known today as Slavic Village was once home to more than 30,000 Polish immigrants. The contributions of other East European immigrant communities to our city, Russian, Czech, Slovak, and more, are memorialized in the cultural gardens that line Martin Luther King Boulevard. The culture of Eastern Europe is woven deeply into the fabric of our city, and Violet Magyar's gift ensures that our university will continue to explore that legacy for decades to come. It's my very great pleasure now to introduce today's speaker and CWRU alum, Professor Kelly St. Pierre. Professor St. Pierre works as an Associate Professor of Musicology at Wichita State University. Her research examines the roles of propaganda in shaping Czech music and its reception through the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the author of Bedřich Smetana, Myth, Music, and Propaganda, as well as publishing in numerous academic journals and volumes. Her newest book project, Trauma and Memory in Czechoslovak Folksong Research, explores the emergence of ethnomusicology alongside notions of ethnic cleansing in 20th century Czechoslovakia. She spent the 2019-2020 academic year researching for this project with the support of a Fulbright grant at the Czech Academy of Sciences Ethnological Institute, as well as serving on the musicology faculty of Prague's Charles University. She is also currently working in Prague, where she comes to us today, as a postdoctoral researcher on the project The Second Sense, Sound, Hearing, and Nature in Czech Modernity at the Center for Theoretical Studies, which is a joint program of both Charles University and the Czech Academy of Sciences. Professor St. Pierre.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here and to learn more about how my alma mater has been, right? And to see familiar faces and names. I'm going to share my screen with you so that I can show you some slides that I'll be looking at. All set there. Great. And I thought I would just start today by telling you a little bit more about the larger project I'm working on. And I think it will be easy to see how it fits into this larger theme of identity. So the thing is, and I thought this was weird, although it's actually not so weird for this part of the world, Folksong research in today's Czech Republic has been state funded since 1905. And the reason that's weird is because today's Czech Republic had a fairly tumultuous political history through the 20th century. Before World War I, the Czech lands were part of the Habsburg Empire, and in 1918, an independent Czechoslovakia, a democracy, became a state for the very first time. Hitler later marched on, occupied, and divided the state into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, as well as Slovakia, starting from 1938. But after World War II, Czechoslovakia once again returned to its independent democracy. But then in 1948, communists supposedly won the elections, so that the state essentially operated as a Soviet satellite, which eventually led to the Russian occupation from 1968. But they overthrew the communist government in 1989, and then in 1991, peacefully split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That's a lot. That's a lot, and that folk research managed to be nearly continuously state-funded through this whole history. It's not just wild, it also means the definitions of folk, like the people to whom such folk songs supposedly belonged, would have had to have changed alongside changing government administrations. So if in the 19th century, understandings of the folk concerned idealized rural peasants, for example, through the 20th, the folk alternatively came to be understood as belonging to an imagined nation, ethnicity, an ethno-nation, a race, a proletarian class, a sometimes fundamentally democratic people, and especially after 1989, a people fundamentally dedicated to human rights. That is because a version of the Czech state funded the research, the researchers were required to research on behalf of the state. And so more than uncovering a repertoire, folk music researchers were tasked with using sound to search for, construct, reimagine, and contest various supposedly Czech identities. And more than scholarship then, their work might be best understood as an instrument of the state, a tool not merely descriptive, but delineative of who belonged and who did not. And so this is the topic of my second book, Trauma and Memory in Czechoslovak Folksong Research, which is what I'm working on now. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the first chapter from the first chapter of this book that covers from 1900 through World War II. But there is a second layer to all of this that makes it even more complicated, which has to do with the politics of memory. So several of the researchers I'm studying in this project are still living, and they, of course, validly might want to control how their activities under communism are presented and recorded. But this tension extends even beyond the level of the individual to the state. Because Czechoslovakia both endured and perpetuated some of the 20th century's traumas, even ways of narrating its basic history become very political very quickly. So much so, for example, that I know of several publishers here in Prague who actually refuse to take on 20th century topics, especially in music. To show you what I mean, and as a way of illustrating the surprising stakes of Czech historiography, and as a way of further introducing my topic for the day, I'm going to share with you a brief address made by an ethnomusicologist named Lubomir Tilner back in 2006. The address was celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Czech Ecological Institute. This is the research organization that has been funded continuously since 1905. So to celebrate this institute's 100-year anniversary, Tilner briefly outlined its 100-year history. He started with its founding in 1905 as the Organizational Committee for Czech Song in Moravia and Silesia. He explained that it remained active until World War I and was reinstated in 1919 as the State Institute for Folksong. He described how its members in 1954 joined with researchers in related fields to form the Department for Ethnography and Folklore Studies. He also paused near the end of his address to remember three institute members, Josef Huder, Petrik Václavek, and Vladimir Helfert, who were all imprisoned and in some cases died, either in concentration camps or Soviet prisons. Tilner made no mistakes in his history, nor unwitting subversions. His address was wholly appropriate to its commemorative celebration and tremendously valid for reflecting the autonomy of today's Czech Republic. Tilner's history was also selective, however, and circumvented the organization's most problematic work alongside German and later Nazi ethno-nationalist researchers. His identification of 1905 as the Ethnological Institute's beginning omitted its founding as part of the Folksong in Austria project in 1902, first imagined by Viennese publisher Universal Edition. Tilner also did not acknowledge the production of Nazi-aligned research facilitated by this organization during the 1930s, nor the execution of German musicologist Gustav Becking during Czechoslovakia's own post-war ethnic cleansing. That is, Tilner's history offered a supposedly Czech history of an idealistically Czech institution, a history most useful to today's Czech Republic, but one also carefully and perhaps even necessarily selective in its narrative. My talk today is going to explore some of the ethics embedded in Czech historiography, Tilner's address illustrating well its stakes. To write a history like Tilner's is to risk inventing a specifically Czech past, whereas moves to write a more broadly defined Czech history might actually mean writing histories of Austria, Austro-Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Nazi Party, the Soviet Union, and Central Europe, among other options. Compounding this ambiguity, and as historian Tara Zafra points out, projects, including my own, that focus on the ways Czech musicians and scholars participated alongside their German nationalist counterparts. These are projects that grant agency to Czechs in situations where they might have lacked it entirely, have the potential to shame history's victims. As a lens onto these ambiguities, my talk today is, like Tilner, going to overview a history of the Ethnological Institute, but with special attention to the ways its work aligned with German nationalist research through the beginning of the 20th century. Although Folksong collection in the Czech lands had to do with inventing supposedly scientific boundaries between Czech and German identities at the beginning of the 20th century, its methods and assumptions came to align with German nationalist research through the interwar years, manifesting in race studies, for example, and helping formulate the discourses that ultimately framed the deaths of musicologists Helfferich and Gustav Becking. By exposing past traumas and drawing attention to when, where, and how they are muted, this talk will also wade into ethically murky waters. And so the second aim of my talk today is to illuminate the ways even modern discussions of Czech folk music, both my own, as well as one of the most recent English language pieces of writing on the topic, which happens to be by Bruno Nettel. For those that are not musicologists in the audience, Bruno Nettel is kind of the founding father of ethnomusicology, like historically the part that would deal with folk song. So the English language writing by Bruno Nettel unwittingly and perhaps even unavoidably participate in the same ethno-nationalist discourses from which they emerged. I would also like to position this circumstance as an opportunity for new inquiry into the field and not a problem. Rather than merely descriptive, studies of Czech folk song might also be understood as still unfolding platforms for negotiating the horrors of the 20th century. Before we explore a history of the Ethnological Institute, however, it is helpful to briefly examine an important context for its founding. As it did elsewhere, Folksong collection in the Czech lands began as a 19th century nationalist project, but shifted to reflect ethno-nationalist thinking by the turn of the 20th century. That is, more than celebrating Czechness, Folksong collection became part of a larger mission to teach and imagine Czech people, usually rural and lower income communities, how to be Czech. Nationalist thought was, of course, driven by the upper and middle classes. This conflation of ethno-nationalism and scholarship met with complementary shifts in period legislature, so that more than celebrating a Czech nation, the Ethnological Institute, upon its founding, was charged with scientifically proving its existence. Near the end of the 19th century, rural communities in the Czech lands would have expected members to be bilingual. This map has the Czech lands underlined for you. When I say Czech lands, it refers to Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, the red underlined at the top there. They expected members to be bilingual. Children were sent on summer or year-long student exchanges between Czech and German-speaking families to facilitate fluency. Marriages were often mixed. Individuals deliberately avoided ethnic alignment, and still others, labeled amphibians by Czech nationalists and later Nazi administrators, moved easily between the Czech and German languages. But from as early as the 1880s, nationalist policymakers and researchers moved to draw supposedly clear boundaries between Czech and German ethnicities, an impulse eventually codified in the 1905 Moravian Compromise. Under this legislation, Moravia's 2.5 million inhabitants were required to register exclusively with either Czech or German political parties, rather than moving freely within an open political landscape. A particular clause within this legislature also granted school boards the right to reclaim Czech students from schools should students' German language skills be deemed insufficient. Bilingual children and children of mixed parents were claimed and reclaimed by Czech and German school boards through the beginning of the 20th century as a consequence. A 1910 update further determined that students might attend German schools regardless of their language proficiency, as long as they were, in fact, German, at least according to supposedly objective third parties. Rather than proficiency exams or parents' self-identification, nationality in these instances would be determined through investigations of parents' social lives, political affiliations, language use, reading habits, and ancestry. These are all modes of investigation aligned with then emerging ethnological research like Folksong collection. For many of you, possibly, that Folksong research at the turn of the century was deeply political may not come as a surprise. There are scholars like Pamela Potter, Ronald Brodano, Philip Bowman, Celia Applegate, Clara Moritz, and Julie Brown, who have all thoughtfully surveyed these developments in their own studies and exposed the interrelationships between German nationalism, specimen culture, and Darwinian assumptions. A 2006 article by Albrecht Schneider is particularly helpful here for its focus on comparative musicology, which was later called ethnomusicology, and systematic musicology. These are the modes of research that most prominently shaped 19th century studies in Czech music and later characterized the work of Ethnological Institute members. Schneider explains that comparative musicology's focus on discovering and mapping ethnographic parallels, or ethnogenesis. These are musical traces, supposedly, across nations and through time, combined with systematic musicology's attention to the physical measurement of subjective listening experience, had the potential to be, and did sometimes become, dangerous. If the morphology of ethnographic parallels made it possible to identify progressive communities, for example, then it was also possible to identify primitive ones. And if measurable listening experience is part of an individual psychology, then those limited hearing, among other possibilities, might be rendered less psychologically able, or at its most extreme, less human. In either case, music research was not necessarily a study unto itself during much of the 19th century, but one of several interdisciplinary methods towards classifying humans, their ethnicity, their biology, and possibly even worthiness. Prague's Charles University was exceptionally well positioned to facilitate ethno-nationalist and separatist research, especially in music. The university had become the first institution in Central Europe to establish a department for musicology in 1869. Neighboring Vienna and Berlin followed in 1870 and 1875. And in 1882, the university divided into separate German and Czech institutions. The German university named Guido Adler head of the musicology department in 1885. Guido Adler is another important musicology name. He is thought of as the founding father of our field in a lot of ways. And it's because of his 1885 article, Scope, Method, and Aim of Musicology. The Czech university named important music critic, researcher, and one-time student of Adler named Otakar Hostinsky as head of their own musicology department. While Adler's research might be more familiar, maybe, Hostinsky's, and especially his collaborations with Charles University's first professor of archaeology and ethnology, whose name was Lubor Niedrle, and I slip, you can pronounce his name either using a Czech accent or a German one, and I tend to move between them both, so my apologies if that seems like I'm changing a lot, but that's okay. Niederle. Might warrant more explanation. Hostinsky published a groundbreaking study in Czech musicology in 1892. It's his 36 melodies of Czech secular folk song from the 16th century. In it, Hostinsky extensively annotated each melody, tracing their supposed ethnogenesis, that's a quote, a direct quote, especially with the aim of protecting the Czech repertoire from possible moments of German-inspired transmission. His study became a cornerstone for all future musicological studies in Czech music, especially in comparative musicology. Niederle's research also regularly made use of comparative musicological methods, especially towards tracing supposed ethnographic parallels between nations and across time. But he also harnessed such tools towards pioneering the field of politically engaged ethnography, a field called on research in early human history to comment on the current political moment, requiring scholars to reach out to politicians and make their expertise accessible to the people. Niederle's research significantly impacted understandings of ethnicity at the time. Though others had previously identified 8 or 9 Slavic ethnicities, Niederle determined the existence of anywhere between 11 to 14. He published his findings in his 1909 The Slavic World, which provided some of the foundational philosophies for redrawing maps in Central Europe after World War I. If Hostinsky and Niederle had already produced scholarship and dialogue with one another, their collaborations yielded important consequences for future musicological and ethnological research. In 1891, the pair founded an organization called the Czechoslovak Ethnographic Society, which became the Ethnographic Institute's most immediate predecessor. And as part of its work, the Ethnographic Society helped host the famous 1895 Czechoslovak exhibition, which attracted over 2 million visitors and presented a culmination of trends in 19th century ethno-nationalist scholarship. The exhibition followed the Folksong model. These are spectacles held in German-speaking centers that showcased members of other, especially African, Asian, and North American communities, performing the activities of their daily lives, and included detailed props and extensive sets. In keeping with this model, the Czechoslovak exhibition included elaborately detailed reconstructions of Czech cultural artifacts, including clothes, food, music, dance, arts and crafts, buildings, and even whole villages, as well as exhibits that incorporated research on Czechoslovak anthropology, statistics, geography, language, psychology, physiology, sociology, and music history, among other topics. The composer, Leoš Janáček, famously performed in its demonstration of Moravian music, and the music exhibit itself included ethnographic analysis in the forms of topographical maps. At over 600 oversized and intricately illustrated pages, the immense tome of a program also positioned Hostinsky's scholarship on Czech folk music alongside chapters discussing skull and facial dimensions. Unlike the Folksong model, however, which were one-time events, the Ethnographic Society also included 154 departments in regions across Bohemia by the time of the exhibition, including 47 in Moravia and 4 in Silesia. And between 1892 and 1895, these individual departments staged 175 of their own exhibitions, 118 in Bohemia, 54 in Moravia, and 2 in Silesia. To put this into perspective, today's Czech Republic is comparable in area to the US state of South Carolina. The Ethnographic Society's demonstrations effectively asserted the otherness of 205 ethno-localities within reasonably close geographical quarters. It would have had to have been the case that you went around a river bend and decided that that was a new ethnicity. When the Ethnographic Institute was founded in 1905, Hostinsky was named head of its Czech department, and Adolf Hoffmann, because Adler had left by then, the German. These hats were divided into smaller departments, including subdivisions for Czech folk song in Bohemia and Czech song in Moravia and Silesia, as well as German song in Bohemia and German song in Moravia and Silesia. Together, members of the organization continued developing the folk song research and collection that had begun under the Ethnographic Society, but with the growing assumption that quantity witnessed the ethnic richness of a particular region, and by extension, the supposed purity of its people. The organization boasted nearly 15,000 folk songs on this front for each the Czech and Moravian Silesian departments by 1920, and 10,000 folk songs in its German department. By now, you might well be wondering what some of these songs actually sounded like, and I am going to play 2 recordings for you, short recordings. The sounds won't actually help me illustrate something specific to the talk. Instead, that quantity of folk songs collected, 40,000, is as, and in some ways, even more important than the sound. But that doesn't make the recordings less cool, and listening briefly will also give me an excuse to point out some of the limitations embedded in folk song research. So here's our first recording through a, to me, kind of charmingly funny accident in history. The earliest Czech folk song recordings from 1909 record Czech bagpipers. So I'm going to play this for you so you can hear it. So that is empirically interesting. The second example, the last example I'll play for you, was recorded by Leos Janáček, the composer, during his field recordings and transcriptions from the year 1912. It is a song about meeting your love on a bridge. And looking forward to that. Here is how it sounds. This is a digitization of a wax cylinder, so the sound quality is also interesting. So these things are absolutely cool. There's a lot to be learned from listening, considering the materials and the technologies they used, how they survived the wars, and so on. For today, I want to focus on the quantity of the folk songs collected even more than the sound, in no small part, but partly because the Ethnological Institute, of course, already has extraordinary records detailing and cataloging these sounds and their histories, so I wouldn't be contributing much there. But also because there are at least 4 important limiting contradictions embedded in folk song research that warrant acknowledgement here now. So now we're thinking about folk song theory. There are 4 points to think about. First is that those supposedly belonging to the folk, the song's most important characteristics for period researchers were that the folks who wrote them remained unknown. Although imagined as widely popular, sung among and across the supposed folk population, most important for researchers was not their popularity or repetition, but that they contained what the researchers believed to be primitive sounds, sounds they deemed authentic to an imagined past rather than contemporary listeners. 3, folk song research, like any nationalist project emerging from the 19th century, seemed to point to the relative stability and autonomy of a past towards projecting a bright future, but also positioned the nation as in crisis. This is that its culture was under threat and needed preservation in the face of decay. This was certainly true in the Czech case. You'll remember that Czechoslovakia didn't gain independence until after World War I. Much of their political work through the 19th century and early 20th centuries had to do with attempting to prove that their culture was distinctive enough to warrant self-rule, but also at risk enough from Habsburg imperialism. And then 4, in addition to nationalist thought, Czech folk song research also emerged in response to the colonialist nationalism facilitated under Habsburg rule. Richard Taruskin aptly summarizes that such attitudes position German sounds and German culture generally as sophisticated, humanizing, and universal, whereas those of all other nations, including Czech, as folk-like and merely national. If this is your first time thinking about sound in these politics, you have experienced the consequences of these philosophies. Our household composer names, the Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, if we're lucky, maybe there's Franz Wagner. These are all by German speakers, but it's not because only German speakers could write good music. There's a whole lot of reasons that they ended up at the center of this canon, but one of them is this belief that German culture was universal and in some ways timeless. So everyone around the world now is expected to know Beethoven. It's been a very successful framework. So altogether, this means that Czech folk song research aimed to elevate an imagined Czech nation to be nationalist, but also to respond to colonialist nationalism by claiming something other than German. Czech folk song was unique, not because it was universal, but because it was extraordinarily specific. For the researchers at the Ethnological Institute, especially before World War I, this meant quantity was as, if not more, important than the sounds themselves. They were searching for extensive evidence of their rich, vibrant, not universal, but instead locally specific living traditions. And quantity mattered as much, if not more, than the sound. This is what motivated collecting 40,000 folk songs within the first 10 years of their existence, and within the space of South Carolina. Unsurprisingly, World War I brought about even new and even more radicalized attitudes towards ethnicity and ethnography, and by extension, changed the organization and program of the Ethnological Institute. Most fundamentally, Nederland's politically engaged ethnography took on new currency, especially in its more radicalized and nominally simplified form of political ethnography, which was formulated by his protege, Karel Hotek. Hotek had assisted Nederland in completing his 1909 Slavic World. Both traveled together as Czechoslovak delegates to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where their expertise helped define new borders between Czechoslovakia and Poland, as well as Yugoslavia and Hungary. But Hotek became most famous for his seminar for general ethnography, which he offered at Charles University from 1932, and in which he presented methods increasingly aligned with Nazi scholarship. The swelling cultural currency of ethnography also manifested in the organization of the Ethnological Institute. Its first leader upon its refounding in 1919 was not a professor of musicology, but Slavic folklorist and friend of Nederland, Jiří Polivka. Similarly, Secretary of the Czech Department, Jiří Horák, helped facilitate increasingly interdisciplinary research through his involvement with Ethnographic Society, which had continued its work alongside the Ethnological Institute. But even more than embracing ethnological research, attitudes towards folk song collection became increasingly radicalized within Ethnological Institute members. From the 1920s, participants called for a compendium of source materials in folk song research to be organized under the editorship of Zdeněk Nejedlý, who is today known most for his later position as Minister of Culture and Education under the Czechoslovak Communist administration. In some ways, he was kind of like the Josef Goebbels of Czechoslovak communism. More than collection for collection's sake, however, their proposed project coincided with Berlin-based German Folklore Union's launch of its Landschaftliche Volkslieder project, also a type of compendium, in 1924. As Philip Bowman has shown us, this project was actually research to support Germany's philosophy of Lebensraum, anticipating its future territorial moves. To that end, the project's first volume in 1924 concerned folksong in Silesia, then under Czechoslovakia, a 1934 volume exploring folksong in Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, the region Hitler would first occupy following the 1938 Munich Agreement, and a 1938 volume focused specifically on Upper Silesia. Additionally, the collection's 43rd volume, though not published until 1971, was collected during Song Weeks held by its committee from 1929 to 39 in southern Moravia. Ethnological Institute members never did complete their compendium. They did, however, during the interwar years, also insert their work into then-emerging conversations on music and race, as modeled by Richard Eichenauer's landmark Musik und Rasse. In particular, 3 of the organization's leading members, which again included Nederle, Hotek, and now Yushi Horak, contributed to a collection on the equality of European races that was published in 1934. These individuals' essays demonstrated the ways interdisciplinary bodies of evidence, including folksong research, could be used to describe the racial composition of Slavs, in the case of Nederle, or example relationships between race and culture, which was Hotek's chapter. Horak's contribution on race and Slavic folktales specifically discussed the usefulness of ethnographic parallels. And though their essays were primarily theoretical, other studies within the book applied their methodologies. So an essay by Vladislav Ruzicka on the chapter title is The Improvement of the State of the Nation by Racial Hygiene or Eugenics. For example, according to the author, listed 40 characteristics of the Nordic man, an ideal of German racial hygiene. He writes, according to the author, the Nordic man is tall, has a slender cranium, has light blue or gray eyes, has light skin, is enterprising and tenacious, has a strong will that borders on callousness, and prioritizes metaphysics. Race was not merely biological or political in this case, but also philosophical and psychological. It is within this increasingly radicalized framework that Ethnological Institute member Vladimir Helfert and musicologist Gustav Becking were killed. Bruno Nettel has situated these scholars' deaths as resulting in part, if not primarily, from their 1936 public scholarly debates, much of which concerned ethnogenesis in supposed Western art music. These researchers analyzed the musical scores of Bohemian composers like Stamitz, Heinrich Bieber, František Benda, and Johann Schubert. Franz Schubert even fell into the discussion to determine their supposedly scientific biological races. Even outside of these debates, however, Helfert's activities had positioned him to become an enemy of the state moving into World War II. In his professional life, he chaired a newly founded musicology department at what is now Maastricht University from 1919. But in his political life, Helfert had also collaborated with the mafia against Austro-Hungary during World War I, given increasingly political and eventually anti-Nazi lectures in his professional work. And just before the Nazi takeover of the university, Helfert smuggled the Brno collection of Ethnological Institute sound recordings into the care of the editorial board of Czech radio. All recordings were returned after the war, only 10 wax cylinders are damaged. Helfert's political background then, at least as much as his conversations with Becking, poised him to receive extra scrutiny under the Protectorate. He was called in for Gestapo questioning in November 1939 and eventually sent to the Nazi camp Terezin. He lived to see the camp's liberation, but died only a few days later of spotted fever on May 18th, 1945. In contrast, Becking worked at Prague's Charles University from 1930 to 45 and was killed during the Czechs' own post-war ethnic cleansing under the Košice program. 2 million Germans were expelled from the country under this initiative, among other targets and modes of cleansing, and prominent German residents living in Prague, like Becking, executed. The careers and deaths of Helfert and Becking remind that Czechs and Germans shared in the same scholarly projects through the 20th century, worked within the same political systems, and even fell victim to mutual, if inverted, acts of cleansing. A brief overview of the research of the Ethnological Institute also reminds that Czech and German scholars were immersed in the same radicalized political discourses through the 20th century, and that their scholarship informed, interacted with, and responded to one another. That both Czech and German history were so deeply intertwined, at times even overlapping, invites us to reconsider the tensions embedded in Czech historiography that opened this talk. A move that also requires pointing to one more instance in which traumas were muted. Bruno Nettel's Ethnicity and Musical Identity in the Czech Lands is an important piece of scholarship not only because it remains one of the most recent pieces of English language writing on the topic, but also because the study foregrounds the complexity of relationships between Czech, German, and Jewish identities. The primary focus of Nettle's study concerns the musical culture of the Germans, ethnic Germans whose principal language was German, which he later adds in some ways died with the departure of the Sudeten Germans after 1945 and the execution of many Germans in Prague. I'm in no way interested in challenging, implicating, and certainly not writing Nettle's account, especially as the author is very forthcoming that he and his family, including his equally groundbreaking father, Paul Nettle, emigrated from Prague in fall 1939. That is, Nettle's narratives about Germans living in and leaving Prague are very much part of his own lived experience. What I am interested in, however, are the ways Nettle's account, like Tilner's address, which opened this talk, carefully moves to negotiate the horrors of the past. I'm also interested in how Nettle's folksong scholarship unwittingly performs the paradoxical argumentation and ethnic assumptions, including, as we have already seen, the possibility that ethnicity might be ascribed to language, for example, as those of past Ethnological Institute members. Nettle's discussion focuses on a 1938 collection of 700 folk songs of the Sudetenland. That is, like Ethnological Institute members before him, Nettle calls on quantity-driven research to evidence the implied richness of a culture. And like Ethnological Institute members before him too, Nettle performs and reinscribes colonialist nationalist frameworks in his writing. And I want to pause to acknowledge our own Daniel Goldmark. Hello, Daniel Goldmark. I thought I understood the correct time for the talk, but I'm prepared to be wrong. Should I try to?
Keep going.
I saw you enter the screen and then didn't know how to interpret that. I will keep going. I'm very suave, no problem. So Nettle performs and reinscribes the colonialist nationalist frameworks that we were discussing in his writing. To refresh our memory, we talked about folk song theory before, and there was that point about colonialist nationalist thinking. This is where German music is thought of as universal and sophisticated and cosmopolitan, but Czech music is other and folk-like and merely national. So in his descriptions of Czech music, Nettle is at risk of reinforcing Czech music's position as merely national, especially in relation to German music. To the Germans, he writes, Czech music was folk music, the music of the versatile vernacular musician, a point he further supports by quoting, "It is a fact explained by the abiding strength of the German-Czech symbiosis that German musicians in particular understand more clearly the character of Czech musical culture in the diaspora than before, acknowledge it, and even miss it as something once a part of their neighborhood." By unproblematically presenting these assertions, Nettle risks reinforcing the colonialist nationalism that has long underpinned folksong study, especially in Central Europe. In this case, German musicians were in some ways so universal in their skill and musicality that they could recognize better than any Czech the uniqueness of Czech folksong repertoires and possibly even claim ownership over them. If Nettle risks reinforcing colonialist nationalist narratives in his descriptions of Czech music, his descriptions of German Bohemian repertoires make their operation more explicit. In particular, Nettle positions German Bohemian music not only as other than German, but perhaps even more other than Czech. He begins by asserting the autonomy of German Bohemian music by pointing to the preface of Folk Songs of the Sudetenland, in which its editors emphasize the song's connection with the German fatherland. More than reflecting the politics of 1938 Central Europe, Nettle interprets this construction as evidence of the decline of German culture and its music in Bohemia. By aligning with the fatherland, Nettle claims, these editors washed what was actually special about the repertoire. Instead, Nettle claims that the specificity of the repertoire resulted from its consistent interactions with the culture of the Slavic-speaking Czechs, with that of the large and ancient community of Bohemian Jews, and more distantly, the Rome. For Nettle, then, German Bohemian repertoire was something simultaneously entirely separate from German, but even more uniquely local than the Czech. If Czech music was exclusive, defined as not German, German Bohemian music was inclusive, its uniqueness dependent upon its interactions with a group of others. German Bohemian folksong in this case was unique not for its straightforward universalism, but unique for its cosmopolitanism, a localized universalism that was still more universal than the specificity of Czech folksong. In some ways, it was just a perfect set of contradictions. The colonialist nationalism underpinning Nettle's writing creates a particularly complicated and compelling framework for his discussions of Jewishness. In particular, Nettle extends the universalism of the German culture to German-speaking Jews, situating them as, to his experience, German-oriented and, quote, culturally German. But more than emphasizing the complexity of identity, Nettle also reveals his decision to include discussions of Jewishness as deeply personal. Nettle offers this introduction to his father and his work. Paul Nettle, my father, born in the Reisengebirge or Kurkonosche Mountains, is among the scholars who, in the publications of the 1920s and 1930s, most emphatically celebrated the German character of Prague. But his earliest works in this line concern the musical life of the Jewish community in Prague in the 16th and 17th centuries. More than introducing his father as a scholar, as well as an authentic German Bohemian, Nettle in this case also rescues him from his most problematic ethnic assumptions. Paul Nettle might have participated in radicalized discourses, but he also carefully considered and validated Jews through studies of their repertoire. Here, Nettle calls on music research, perhaps even folksong research, to bear witness to the complex, thoughtful, and cosmopolitan thinking of his father. Curiously, however, Nettle also stops just short of straightforwardly acknowledging that both he and his father once identified as Jewish. Instead, he argues that many of the Jewish musicians of the 20th century Prague considered themselves ethnic Germans in the most definitive sense. He does quote his father once after the war, explaining that rather than identifying as Jewish, he grew a German beak. Taken together, this means that Nettle chose to emphasize his father's openness to Jewish culture without making the same sorts of authenticity claims to Jewishness as he had a German Bohemian identity, and all while denying possible alignment as ethnic Jews. In total, Nettle's study is a deeply personal statement in addition to a scholarly text, a narrative that, much like Tilner's address, which opens this paper, omits or rewrites some of history's traumas in a necessary move to negotiate its most difficult components. And as in all studies exploring folk music research, including my own, the topic demands ethical maneuvering. For scholar Tarla Zahra, whose articulation of this tension I cited at the outset of this talk, the outcomes of her research outweighed the risks built into the historiography of Czech nationalism. Here, the risks I take in drawing attention to the nuanced readings of Nettle, as well as some of his omissions, similarly hopes to embrace the ethical decisions embedded in Czech historiography as an opportunity and not a problem. Doing so illuminates Czech folksong research as in the past an instrument of ethno-nationalism, not merely descriptive, but delineative of who belonged and who did not. It also illuminates the study of Czech folk music today as part of continually unfolding negotiations of the 20th century's traumas. We can acknowledge that this is a new format for everyone, right? Speaking out into the ether, that's fine, no problem.
Thank you. Kayla, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
I can.
Thank you. That was great. I have a couple questions that have come in that I want to put to you. Can you talk about, so you use the word authentic. The word authentic comes up several times, and I know that's a kind of a loaded term.
Yeah.
What counted as authentic to do we know what counted as authentic really to the researchers when they were collecting the 40,000 folk songs?
Right. This is a tremendously valid question and important. I always tried to put it as supposedly authentic. They believed in the authenticity. And what you're pointing to is how unstable that is, right? What was authentic to one person, the next person didn't agree on. And even then, they're imagining the sounds of an imagined past. So it's not even, it's the act of making it authentic is happening at the site of the individual. It's not happening in the music or the sound. So right, it is, the question was, how was I using it, right?
The question was, what do we know what specifically they were looking for? Or, did they have a, if someone sings it, it's authentic, right? If it's like some person in a village and I can write it down and then that it counts. Or was there anything they would have excluded,
I mean, they liked it. If the performers were older, that made it even better. If the performers could prove provenance of the song, they would actually take notes over who the performer was and how old they thought the song was. But as usual, the most important thing was that they didn't know who the author was. So it could have been a great way to think about the repertoire from this time that is less political is just to call it vernacular music, right? There was music that was out there. If they didn't know the author, then it was more authentic and more of a folk song. It was not a stable idea that they all agreed upon.
Well, and you mentioned this early in the talk, I think, and you kind of just alluded to it. How does this, what was going on in the 20th century, relate to the construction or the creation of what a Czech sound was in the 19th century?
They are inventing a Czech art music repertoire at the same time that these folk song collections are happening. So they are trying to invent something that sounds authentically Czech to them at any given moment. Of course, there are all sorts of arguments about this. It actually becomes part of their political platforms. There were two political parties. They both adopted platforms on what kind of folk song was right and how much folk song should be incorporated into opera. All of these things are happening. So the stakes are high and no one agrees because they're all in a process of making them up as they go.
Because there's a deep investment in this idea that these musics somehow prove or support the idea of nationhood?
Absolutely. I think this is a limited comparison, but useful anyway. It's a lot like the American dollar because the American dollar is just paper and ink. It is backed not even by gold anymore. So the thing that gives it value is us, that we ascribe meaning to it, and it can fuel whole economies. So like the consequences are very real, but the value is not in the dollar, it's in the individual people engaging with that dollar, right? So the stakes, it doesn't seem like talking about Czech opera would hold the same currency or value as the dollar, but for some thinkers at the time it did. So it's similar conversations.
Another question that came in, how fuzzy are the boundaries around groups of ethnic folk songs?
They are very fuzzy. This is a great question. Like one of the things the Ethnological Institute still struggles with is how to catalog the songs or how to organize them. They've got this amazing giant collection that they don't really know what to do with, and it's like nearly double in size now, they organize it by collector right now, by person. I mean to validate the question. It's creating those boundaries would be also an artificial process in a lot of ways.
Was this kind of folk song collecting going on elsewhere in the world at this time?
Yes, it was. Throughout all of Western Europe, certainly. And we hear about the composers Bartók and Kodály doing a lot of this more towards the Hungarian side. In the US, collectors started doing similar things a bit later, but it is also happening. But there is something interesting. Oh, and Ireland is another good one. But there is something interesting about nationalist movements and people starting to think in terms of nations and not class, where they decided that they needed to have sounds to tie them to the soil and to borders instead of to people, if that makes sense. So That is a general movement of thought across thinkers in Europe and the US eventually in the 19th century.
Slight pivot. How did the bagpipe make it into Eastern Europe?
Right? Yes. I did not know this history. I had to learn it. Apparently, and I will not claim expertise, but what I think I understand is that the original bagpipes are from the Middle East, and they end up moving over here, and there are records of it in the Middle East in 2000 BC. There are records, and they end up moving over here, and we have records of them from the 16th century, and so does the area that is now Scotland. So I think they were just kind of a prominent instrument in a way that I never recognized before doing this. Learn new things all the time. I think that's a fair question.
Can you talk about how your talk fits into the larger book project that you're working on?
Absolutely. So this first part to do with the first half of the century is so interested in the thinkers in this part of the world are so interested in race and inventing race studies. The second half here, because it was not taken over, because communist thinking became such a big part of the world here, ethnicity is not supposed to exist, supposedly, under communism. Everyone's equal. You don't need race or ethnicity. Obviously, in reality, it did. But this was a problem that these thinkers actually recognized. And moreover, race research was seen as something German, which if you are Eastern European after World War II, or a lot of Europeans, but especially after Hitler marched on Russia after 1941, German things are not allowed anymore. So they need to erase the idea of race. They need to invent something that is now proletarian. So there's this whole new process of invention. So this chapter 1 had to do with race. Chapter 2 will do with communism. Slovakia is its own set of thinking that is deeply curious and intricate. The last chapter is going to be about memory politics and traumatic spaces. I'll be looking at some of the music in the Nazi camp Terezin and how we talk about it. That is the plan for the larger book.
Another question just came in. So all these folk songs represent the Czech culture prior to the Treaty of Trianon? If I'm mispronouncing that, that's a question.
I will happily ask. I'm embarrassed. If someone could help me recognize this treaty, that would be great. I will say the Czech state was not an independent state until 1918. It tried after. This is so embarrassing. That's okay. They tried after Hungary gained independence in 1866. They wanted to gain some sort of independence within the Habsburg monarchy after that happened, but they've never gained it.
Just looking up, it looks like that's 1920.
1920. Okay. So I hope I addressed that correctly then.
I think you did.
Yeah. Okay. See, it's like the bagpipe. I'm learning things new all the time.
We all do.
This is good.
I think that's our last question. So thank you very much.
Nope, thank you. It's, again, a pleasure to get to come back and hang out for a second. Thank you.